Her brother rode in a week after the sale was finalized. A Lakota chief undid the papers that day. The deed was already in somebody else's name when Sungilla came to find me. She didn't come to my lodge. She wouldn't do that not to ask something. She came to the edge of the winter camp and stood there in the cottonwood shadow until one of the boys saw her and ran to tell me. I knew who it was before he finished speaking. There aren't many women who stand the way Sungilla stands. Like she isn't waiting for anything and isn't afraid of anything, but there's something behind her eyes that she is keeping very carefully folded. I put on my coat and walked out to her. It was cold. November cold, the kind that comes down off the hills in the morning and doesn't leave. She had a wool blanket over her shoulders that her husband used to wear, the red one with the black stripe. Chayton had been dead 14 months. The blanket still looked like him. She didn't greet me the long way. She said, "Amos sold the land." I let that sit for a moment. I knew the land she meant, 40 acres on the South Fork of Antler Creek. Chayton had worked that ground for 11 years. Good soil, heavy timber on the upper quarter, a spring that ran clear through August. She had lived there since her marriage. Her children had been born in the house Chayton built. I said, "When?" 6 days ago. Amos brought a man from Bismarck. They went to the land office together. I didn't know until 2 days after. "Whose name is it in now?" "A man named Grover Callies. He has a logging operation near Mandan." I looked at her. The blankness in her face was the kind you put on when you are holding something very heavy and you don't want anyone to see how heavy it is. I knew that look. My wife had worn it for 2 years before she died, and I finally understood what it was she'd been carrying. "Is the land yours or was it Chayton's?" She said it was mine before the marriage. My father gave it to me. That was what I needed to know. I want to say something about Amos Fourstar before I go further, because a man should be understood before he's judged, and I have thought about Amos a long time. He was 10 years older than Sungilla. Their father died when she was 7, and Amos was the one who raised her, more or less, in between his own troubles. He wasn't a cruel man. He was a weak one, and a weak man with a debt is a more dangerous thing than a cruel man with nothing. Amos owed money to 3 different people in Bismarck. Cards mostly. Some of it drink. He had used up his own land 2 years before and spent a winter convincing himself that the 40 acres on Antler Creek were really his to decide about, because hadn't he watched Sungilla grow up, hadn't he been the one to put food in front of her after their father passed? That's the story a weak man tells himself. I've heard it in a dozen forms. The man from Bismarck, this Grover Callies, had come out to that country specifically to buy timber land cheap. He knew Amos. He'd probably known for months that there were 40 acres on Antler Creek, with a woman living on them alone and a brother who could be persuaded. Men like Callies are patient. They find the right leverage and they wait. What Amos got, I found out later, was $400. Which was about a quarter of what the land was worth, and less than a third of what the timber on the upper quarter would have sold for on its own. $400, his sister's home. I didn't go to the land office that day. I want to be clear about that. Some men would have ridden in angry, and that is a fast way to accomplish nothing. I went home and I ate and I slept, and in the morning I woke before light and lay in the quiet and thought the whole thing through. My name among the whites in that county was Running Elk, because that was the name they could say, and because it was close enough to my actual name that I'd stopped fighting it 20 years ago. I had lived in that territory since before most of the white men there had arrived. I knew the land office agent, a man named Whitfield, because I had stood in front of him 7 times in 15 years on various matters concerning various pieces of ground. He was a fair man, mostly, which in that county meant he was at least embarrassed when he did something wrong. I also knew something about the law, not the kind that comes from schools, the kind that comes from watching what holds and what doesn't, decade after decade, in a county where the rules keep changing but the land doesn't. I had watched treaties get broken and fences go up and men I respected lose everything to paperwork. I had learned over a long time that the paperwork could sometimes be turned the other direction. Not always, but sometimes, if you knew where to press. Sungila's land had been her father's. He had held a land grant issued in 1871 under the terms of a homestead agreement. When he died, the land had passed to her by right of inheritance. There was a document to that effect, witnessed and filed. Her marriage to Chayton had not changed her ownership. She had never signed the land over to him. It was hers. Which meant that Amos, whatever he believed about himself and his authority, had sold something that was not his to sell. I rode into Dickinson on a Thursday morning, which was the day Whitfield was always at the land office before noon. I wore my coat and my hat, and I carried the paper I'd spent Wednesday evening finding. The copy of Sungila's father's grant that she had kept folded inside a Bible in the bottom of her cedar chest. She had brought it to me Tuesday night without me asking, which told me she had already been thinking about what needed to happen. Whitfield was at his desk. He was a thin man with a red face that turned redder in cold weather. He looked up when I came in and he didn't look surprised, exactly, but he looked like a man who has been expecting something he was hoping to avoid. I sat down across from him without being invited, and I put the paper on his desk, and I told him to read it. He read it. He didn't say anything for a while. Outside, somebody was moving a wagon and the wheels were loud on the frozen ground. He said, "Running Elk, I processed that sale myself. Amos Fourstar presented as the seller." What right did Amos Fourstar have to sell land registered to his sister? He presented as he said he was handling her affairs. Did she sign anything? A pause, there was a signature. Whose signature? He looked at me, I looked at him. "Let me see the file," I said. It took him a while to find it. I don't know if he was looking slowly on purpose or if he was genuinely a slow file finder. I sat and waited. I was good at waiting. I had been good at it for a long time. He put the file on the desk. I looked at the signature line. Sungila Chayton, it said. In handwriting that was not hers. I knew her handwriting. She had given me 2 letters over the years about various matters and I had kept them. The handwriting on the deed was rounder and heavier and looped on the S in a way she never did. I said, "That's not her signature." He looked at it again. He said carefully, "I can't make that determination myself." "No," I said, "but a judge can." I let that land. I let it sit there between us on that desk with the file and the paper and the cold light coming in through the window. Whitfield was quiet for a long time. He was not a dishonest man. He was a man who had processed a transaction that he now understood was wrong, and he was trying to find the shape of what to do about it. I could see him working through it. His face went through several versions of itself. He said, "If there's a legal challenge, it has to go through the circuit court." "I know where it goes," I said. "I'm telling you now so that you understand what the record will show, that a transfer of title was recorded in your office with a forged signature." He looked at me for a moment longer. Then he opened a drawer and took out a different piece of paper and began to write. Amos came in about 40 minutes after I sent the boy to find him. I had asked Whitfield if I could wait, and he had said yes and gone to make himself coffee and not offered me any, which was fine. I sat in the chair by the window and looked at the street. I watched 2 men argue about a horse. I watched a woman in a green coat cross the street with a child on each hand. I watched a dog find something under a wagon and lie down next to it and go to sleep. Then Amos came in. He was a big man, soft in the middle now, wearing a coat that had been good once. He saw me and he stopped in the doorway, and I watched his face do the calculation. He knew who I was. He knew I was Sungila's husband's friend. Chayton and I had ridden together for 3 years on the reservation boundaries, and that was a bond that doesn't come apart when one man dies. Amos had always been slightly careful around me, in the way that men are careful around someone, whose opinion of them they know is low. He looked at Whitfield. Whitfield was looking at his desk. Amos said, "What's this about?" I said, "Sit down, Amos." He didn't sit right away. He stood there for a moment like he was thinking about whether to be angry. Then he sat. I said, "The signature on the deed is not your sister's." He said, "I had the authority." "You didn't," I said. "The land was hers by inheritance. It was never Chayton's, and he never transferred it, and she never gave you power to act on her behalf. You sold land that wasn't yours." "I'm her family." "You are her brother," I said. "That's different." Amos looked at the desk. His big hands were on his knees, and he was gripping his own legs the way a man does when he is trying not to show something. He said quietly, "I needed the money." "I know you did," I said. There was nothing else to say about that. We both knew what it was. I said, "What Whitfield is preparing is a notice that the transfer is under dispute pending verification of the seller's signature. The sale to Grover Callies is suspended. The title reverts to its last valid holder while the question is open." Amos looked up at me. Something in his face, not relief, but something like it. Like he'd known this was wrong and had been carrying that knowledge for 6 days, and here it was, out in the open, and he didn't have to pretend anymore. He said, "What happens to me?" I said, "That's not my business. That's your sister's business. You should go talk to her." Whitfield processed the suspension that afternoon. He was efficient about it once he decided to do it, which I respected. He sent a rider to the Callies operation near Mandan with a notice that the transaction was suspended pending authentication of the seller's signature. Callies apparently sent a reply by wire that was not polite, but Whitfield filed it and didn't act on it. 2 weeks later, a judge from the circuit court looked at the signature and agreed it wasn't Sungilla's. 4 weeks after that, which was the fastest that kind of thing moved in that county and era, the title came back to her. I wasn't there for any of that. I'd done my part. Whitfield handled the rest, partly out of fairness and partly, I think, because he understood that if he didn't, the whole story would eventually come out in a way that would not reflect well on him. There is something I want to say about what happened between me and Sungilla, and I want to say it carefully because it is something I have turned over in my mind many times, and I'm still not entirely sure I know the shape of it. She came to my camp on the night Whitfield sent his rider to Mandan. Somebody had told her, I don't know who. She came at dusk, that same red and black blanket over her shoulders, and she stood at the edge of the camp the same way she'd stood the first time, and one of the same boys found me again. I sometimes think that boy was paying attention to things he shouldn't have been. I walked out to her. The light was going and the cold was settling in, and her breath was making a small pale cloud in the air in front of her face. She said, "They told me what you did." I said, "Whitfield did it." "You made him." I didn't argue with that. I hadn't made him exactly. I had shown him what the right thing was and let him see clearly enough that he'd chosen it. But I knew what she meant. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved the blanket at her shoulder and she pulled it tighter. She said, "Why?" The question surprised me a little. I thought about how to answer it. I could have said, "Because Chayton was my friend and I owed him." I could have said, "Because what Amos did was wrong." Both of those things were true. I said, "Because it was your land." She looked at me for a moment, and then she did something I did not expect. She reached out and put her hand on my chest, flat against the front of my coat, and she left it there. Not grabbing, not holding, just resting there like she was making sure I was solid, like she needed to know I was real. I put my hand over hers. That was all. We stood there in the cold at the edge of the camp while the last light left and the stars came out one by one, and I didn't say anything and she didn't say anything, and it was the most honest thing that had happened to me in years. I should say something about the years between. I don't say it to make myself sound long-suffering, because I'm not built that way and I don't think it serves anything. But there is a kind of life a man can fall into, not a bad life, not a small life, but a life that has closed around itself. You get things done. You handle what needs handling. People come to you because you are the kind of man who knows what to do, and you do it, and they go away, and the lodge is quiet again. I was 61 years old that winter. My wife had been dead 9 years. I had 2 sons and a daughter, and they were all grown and gone to different parts of the territory. The camp was my family, and I was head of it, and that was right, and I was glad of it. But gladness and fullness are different things, and there were nights when the difference was very clear to me. Chayton had known that about me. He was perceptive in a way that he never made obvious. Once, maybe 4 years before he died, we were riding back from the east boundary after a long day, and he said, out of nowhere, without any preamble, "You should not always be alone." I told him I wasn't always alone. I had the whole camp. He said, "That's not what I mean, and you know it." I told him to mind his own land, and he laughed, and we didn't speak of it again. He knew is the thing. And he had a wife who could see clearly, and I think, though I can't know this, that he had said something to her, in the way that married people speak of things that are never said aloud. Amos came to see me about 3 weeks after the title was restored. I won't say I was surprised. Amos was not a villain. He was a man who had done a wrong thing and now had to find a way to live alongside himself, and I think coming to see me was part of how he was working that out. He sat down and he didn't say anything for a while, and then he said, "I want to pay it back. What Callie's paid me, to Sungilla." I said, "That's not my thing to accept or refuse." "I know, I'm telling you because she won't see me right now, and I wanted someone to know I mean it." I looked at him. He meant it. A man who means something looks a specific way, there's no performance in it, just the weight of the thing. I said, "Tell me when you have the money. I'll tell you whether she'll hear you." He nodded. He put his hat back on and he left. He came back in February with $380, which was most of it. He'd sold his horse and some tools. I took the money to Sungilla, and she took it without speaking and put it in the cedar chest next to her father's land grant. Whether she ever spoke to Amos about it, I don't know. That was between them. The spring came late that year. The snow was still on the ground into April, and the creek ran high and brown for weeks after it finally melted. I went to the Antler Creek place in early May to help her clear a fence line that had gone down under the winter. She was already working when I got there. She had a heavy coat on and mud on her boots, and she was pulling wire with her bare hands, which was the kind of thing she did that I had stopped trying to talk her out of. I tied my horse and went and worked the other end of the run, and we worked through the morning without much talking, which was how we generally worked. Around noon, she built a small fire and made coffee, and we sat on the fallen section of fence and drank it. The upper quarter of the land was in new growth, scrub oak, and poplar coming up between the timber that was still standing. The spring light was thin and clear, and the creek made a sound below us that was good to sit next to. She said, "I'm going to plant the east field this year." I said, "What?" "Chayton never got around to it. It's good ground." "I'm going to plant it." I said, "That's a lot of work alone." She looked at me sideways. A long look, the way she did sometimes when she was deciding whether to say a thing. She said, "Who said anything about alone?" I looked at her. She was looking at the field. Her jaw was set and her eyes were steady, and she had that folded behind quality she always had, except right now it seemed to me that some of it was coming unfolded. Not dramatically, just at the edges, like a door that has been shut for a long time being opened a crack, the way you do in spring to let the house breathe. I said, "I'll come back next week with the plow." She didn't say anything. She poured the last of the coffee onto the ground and stood and went back to the fence line, and I sat there another moment looking at the field and the light on it, and then I got up and followed her. I want to finish here because this is where the story actually ends, or where it changes shape into something else. The rest of it, the planting, the summer, what grew out of that spring on Antler Creek, that is a different kind of thing, and I don't have the words for all of it, and maybe a man shouldn't need them. What I know is this. I rode home that evening the long way, around the south bend of the creek where the banks are high and the willows come down to the water. The light was doing something particular on the hills, orange going to pink going to that thin color that has no name, just before dark. My horse was unhurried and I didn't push him. I let him pick the pace. I thought about Chayton. I thought about him the way you think about the dead when you're not sad about them anymore, just grateful. The years rode with us like that, quiet. I thought about the deed in the land office with her father's name on it, restored to the right file. I thought about Whitfield's face when he chose to do the right thing. I thought about Amos with $380 in his hand, and the look of a man who has found the lowest rung and is starting to climb. I thought about her hand on the front of my coat, flat and still, the weight of it. A man carries certain things a long time. Some of them are stones and some of them are seeds, and most of the time you can't tell which is which until spring. I rode home. The stars were up. The campfire was lit. I could see it from a long way out and I rode toward it, the way you ride toward something you know is yours.